In this lesson, you will learn what to do throughout the IELTS speaking test, strategies for what to do in parts 1, 2 and 3, and I'll explain to you what to expect from the IELTS examiner in your IELTS test. My name is Lar Ryan. I've been an IELTS examiner and an IELTS teacher at the British Council. I have over a decade of experience with the IELTS test, and I am the founder of Complete Test Success. So in brief, the IELTS speaking test has 3 different parts, and combined this takes about 15 minutes. And the questions that you're asked in each part are quite different, so that's why we have different strategies for each one. So before we look at specific advice for parts 1, 2 and 3, I have some advice that applies to all parts. Firstly, you need to be aware of what you can and what you cannot ask the IELTS examiner. The IELTS examiner cannot interact with you except if you ask these 2 particular questions. The first question is you ask the examiner to repeat what they've said. The second question is where you ask the examiner the meaning of a phrase in the question. Now, not the meaning of the question, the meaning of a specific phrase. So if, for example, the question was, where do you do most of your shopping? You could say, what does most of your mean? Next, it's very important that you think before you speak, so make sure you know what you're going to say before you begin. The problem if you start speaking straight away is that you're going to need to take a break to think in the middle of the sentence, and that will bring down your coherence and cohesion score. So just think first, decide what you're going to say, and then say it. It's also very important that you stay on topic. If you answer a question and it's off topic, that will not help your score. But also if you answer a question correctly, but then the development goes off topic, that will also affect your score. And finally, you shouldn't memorize any answers that you intend to use in the IELTS speaking test. The IELTS examiner will recognize you're doing this straight away, and any of the good vocab or grammar that you use in a memorized answer will not help your score. Also, a lot of IELTS students use phrases to buy time, such as, oh, that's a good question, or oh, let me think about that for a moment. But really, this just prolongs the inevitable. If you need time to think, but then you say the phrase, and then you need time to think again, and then you answer the question, that doesn't make as much sense as just waiting until you're ready, spending all the time you need thinking first, and then answering the question. So altogether, it's much better to avoid these types of phrases. It's also crucial that you accept your own ability when you're in the IELTS speaking test. If you try to pretend that your vocab is better than it is, or you try to use grammar structures that you never use, you're just going to make mistakes and you're going to confuse the IELTS examiner because they don't know what you're talking about. A much better approach is to just focus on clear communication, don't take risks, and make sure that you get the best score you can, rather than pushing yourself beyond your ability and actually reducing your score. Also, you can just use an informal tone in the IELTS speaking test. It feels like a job interview, it feels like a formal setting, but you can just speak the way you normally speak when you're speaking to friends or family or whoever you speak to in English. So just be yourself and speak the way you normally speak. Also, in the IELTS speaking test, when you're linking your ideas together, do not use the cohesive devices you learn for IELTS writing, because those are too formal. Okay, so if you're learning something from this lesson, make sure to subscribe to my channel and like my page so that you see more of these lessons. So now we're going to look at part 1 of the IELTS speaking test, and I have specific advice for this part of the test. And here are examples of these questions. I'm not going to read them out, but feel free to pause the video and read them yourself. What you'll notice about these questions is that they're quite basic and they don't require much thought. These are really just designed to help you get warmed up, and they allow the examiner to distinguish between the lower band scores for a weak candidate. Now, the first thing to note about part 1 is that each topic is introduced by the examiner before they start asking the questions. So, if you pay attention to the topic and then suddenly you notice the question was about a different topic, it's very likely that you've misheard the question and you can just ask the examiner to repeat what they've said. So let's look at an example of this. Now I'm going to ask you some questions about clothes. So when you hear the examiner say that, you know that the next 4 questions will be about this topic. So besides that, I have a specific strategy that I want you to follow for every part 1 question that you're asked. Now the purpose of the strategy is to make sure that you fully develop your answer, to get yourself a high score, and also to make sure that your answer is focused and that you don't go off topic. So step 1, you're going to give a direct answer. Step 2, you'll say why or why not. Step 3, you'll add one more relevant detail. Step 4, you will stop talking. Now, by give a direct answer, I mean in the first 5 or 6 words, say exactly what the question requires you to say. So if the question says, where do you normally buy your clothes? You don't want to start by saying how much you like or dislike buying clothes. You want to start by actually saying where. So you would say, I normally buy them at my local supermarket. So in the second step, you explain your answer by saying why or why not. So I will say, I normally buy my clothes at the supermarket because I'm already going there to buy my food and that's convenient for me. Now by doing that, I don't need the examiner to ask me why or why not. I've already explained it by myself. And you need to do that for absolutely every answer. Next, you're just going to add one more relevant detail, but this step is not essential. If you have an extra relevant, and I mean it has to be related to the topic, if you have one more relevant detail, include it. If you cannot think of something, that's okay and you can skip this step. So to add one more relevant detail to my answer, I would say, I normally buy my clothes in my local supermarket because I'm already going there to buy food and that's convenient for me. As well as that, the clothes are actually quite reasonable, so I don't feel like I'm wasting money when I buy them at that supermarket. And step 4 is to stop talking. And the reason that I've included this step in the strategy is because over and over again, I see IELTS candidates where they've said what they want to say, but then the examiner doesn't look at them or the examiner doesn't ask the next question, so they start to get nervous and they repeat the ideas, or perhaps they start talking about a different topic, talking about the supermarket in general, or talking about another place where they buy clothes. All of these things will bring down your fluency and coherence score. So really, when you're finished, just stop and then wait for the examiner to ask the next question. So if you want to get my feedback on your IELTS speaking, make sure to sign up for my free live feedback lessons. You can find a link to join those in the video description. So now let's look at part 2. And what happens here is the examiner gives you a pen and a piece of paper and will tell you that you can make notes for 1 minute before you start speaking. Then they will give you a cue card with a topic. So what you're going to do is look at that card, make notes for a minute, and then you need to speak unassisted for 2 minutes. And what that means is that the examiner will not be helping you, the examiner will not be asking you new questions, it's just you by yourself speaking for that 2 minutes. Firstly, I want to look at when to make notes because this is a bit confusing. So the examiner will never say, now you can start making notes. There's never a clear instruction like that. What will happen is they will give you the pen, they will give you the paper, they will ask you if you understand what's happening in this part of the test. When you say yes, they give you the cue card. And then they will say, I want you to describe, and they'll say whatever the topic on the cue card is. That's when you start making notes. So just be aware that the instruction to start making notes now isn't coming, so don't wait for that. So this here is what the cue card that I was talking about looks like. There's a topic at the top and then some prompts about what you should say. Now, the first thing you want to do is to focus on the topic and make sure that you understand it clearly. This particular question says a sporting event you enjoyed. So it doesn't say a sporting event you went to. It doesn't say a sporting event that you saw. It's just that you enjoyed that sporting event. So what that means is we can talk about an event we saw on TV, an event that we participated in ourselves, an event that we actually went to and bought a ticket for and saw live, like an international football game. Any of those things is acceptable for this topic. And the next thing we want to do is we want to decide on exactly which event we're going to speak about. So you might have 4 or 5 in mind, but you need to choose just one. So that's the second thing that you're going to do. It's worthwhile taking your time while you're choosing which event you want to speak about, because if you choose one that's difficult to discuss or you choose one that you don't have the vocabulary to talk about, that will make the rest of part 2 very difficult. So for me, I'm going to choose a rugby match that I saw with my family at a restaurant. After that, we're just going to go through each of the prompts and decide on what we will say. So which sport it was rugby. Where were you? I was in a restaurant in Kerry. When it happened when I was about 14. Explain why you enjoyed the occasion. Because my national team won. So first of all, I would recommend that you don't write down your ideas here. You're going to be talking about them in about 45 seconds. You're not going to forget that quickly. So just think of your ideas for each prompt and then move on to the next part of the strategy. Now, the next part of the strategy is because after you've answered all the questions on the cue card, you've probably only taken about 45 to 60 seconds. So you need more things to say for the rest of the 2 minutes. Also, we want to stay focused on the same topic that we chose. So in my case, it was that rugby game. I'm not going to talk about a different rugby game or a different occasion. I'm going to stay focused on the exact same topic. Anything relevant you say is appropriate, but I have some ideas to help you with this. You can say how you would change it, something you don't like about it, if you'd recommend it to others, will it happen again in the future? Now, these are just to guide you into thinking of other things to say. You don't need to use all of them. You don't need to use any of them if you have other ideas you prefer. But these will just help you have enough things to say to get you to the end of those 2 minutes. So let me go through each one as an example for you. So how would I change the sporting event that I enjoyed? I wish we had watched it from the beginning. Something you don't like about it? I wish we hadn't been sitting so close to the TV. If you'd recommend it to others? I would definitely recommend it to anyone from my country because it's one of the few sports that we ever win at. Will it happen again in the future? I don't think I'll ever enjoy another match that much because I was more excitable when I was younger. Now, of course, we only have 1 minute before we have to start speaking, so we're not going to write all of this down. First of all, the actual ideas to help you think of what to say, you'll just remember these before your IELTS speaking test. You don't need to write them on the piece of paper. So we can just remove those. But even at that, my writing isn't fast enough to put all of this on a piece of paper in 30 seconds or less. So this is what I would really write. Instead of saying, I wish we had watched it from the beginning, I would just write down, didn't see the start. Instead of, I wish we hadn't been sitting so close to the TV, I would write, sitting too close. Instead of, I would definitely recommend it to anyone from my country because it's one of the few sports that we ever win at, I would write, to any Irish. And instead of this last part, I don't think I'll ever enjoy another match that much because I was more excitable when I was younger, I would write, less excitable now. And remember, you're the only person who's ever going to look at these notes. They're just to help you remember what you want to say while you're speaking for 2 minutes. You don't need a lot of detail, you don't need accurate vocabulary, you don't need accurate grammar. You just need something to look at to remind you, oh, now I can say this next, if you freeze up or you can't think of what to say during the 2 minutes. So that is what my notes would look like. That's just 13 words and I can definitely write that much in 30 seconds or less. Now let's look at what you're going to do while you're actually speaking for 2 minutes. So after you've had 1 minute to make notes, the examiner will say, you can start speaking now. And at that point, straight away, launch into your answer. Don't continue making notes because your notes aren't going to help you with your IELTS score. So this is what you should do during that 2 minutes. First of all, you're going to focus on the cue card and you're going to go through each of the points that you already considered and just say them and flesh them out into a full answer. Once you've finished saying all of those things, you turn to your notes and again, you go through each of those one at a time. Now, you want to stay speaking until the examiner stops you. The examiner will be looking at a stopwatch and once there's 2 minutes, they will say, thank you. And that's your cue to stop speaking. Now, ideally, you will have more things that you wanted to say, but because the 2 minutes are up, you stop. Now, when you're practicing for part 2 of the IELTS test, I would recommend that you push yourself further than what's actually expected. So instead of aiming for 2 minutes, aim for 3 minutes. When you can do that, aim to speak for 4 minutes. So just 1 minute to make notes and try to speak for 3, 4 or 5 minutes. That way, when you get to the real IELTS test, it will be much easier than what you've prepared yourself to do. Now, after you've been speaking for 2 minutes, the examiner will take back their stuff and they'll ask you one more question. But they just want a short 1 or 2 word answer in response. If you try to develop this answer, they will stop you in the middle of what you're saying. Now, I hope this lesson is helping you, and you can also help me by clicking like on this video and also sharing it in any IELTS groups or with any IELTS students that you know. And that brings us to IELTS Speaking Part 3. These are the types of questions you can expect in this part of the test. And what you'll see is that they require you to think more deeply and they require you to formulate opinions and think about something that you've probably never thought of before. And that's why part 3 is actually the trickiest part of the whole speaking test. So let's look at how to answer these questions. Firstly, I want you to think of one idea. Now, you might think of several ideas, but the best way to develop your answer is to have just one. Like part 1, you're going to begin with a direct answer to the question. you're going to explain it by saying how or why. This time, you're going to give an example and you can state the outcome. Now, with step 4 and step 5, it's not essential to have both of these in every answer, but you should aim to have at least one and both if possible. And then again, you're going to stop speaking once you've finished saying what you want to say. So let me just give you an example for this question. Why do some people prefer individual sports rather than team sports? So first I need to think of one idea. So somebody might prefer an individual sport just because they like the sport. Oh, that's too vague. It might be because they are easier to organize because there are fewer people. It might be because the person likes to work alone. Maybe they're an introvert. But I don't want to use all of those ideas. I need to choose one. I'm going to go with it's easier to organize. Next, I need to begin with a direct answer. So for this, I'll just say, I think it's because they're easier to organize. Next, I want to explain my answer. I think this is because it's easier to organize because you don't need a lot of other people in the same place at the same time when you want to play the sport. Then we'll give an example. I think it's because it's easier to organize because they don't need as many people in the same place at the same time. For example, someone playing football needs another 30 players on the pitch, whereas somebody playing badminton just needs one other player on the court with them. Next, we're going to state the outcome. I think it's because they're easier to organise because they don't need so many people in the same place at the same time. Compared to a team sport like football, where they need 30 players on the pitch, a sport like badminton just needs 2 people. So if you're to organise a sport like that, you just need to make one phone call and then you're ready to go. And finally, you stop talking and wait for the next question. Now, the thing about part 3 is that you will struggle at some point. This is because the examiner is going to be pushing you so that they can find your upper limit. Just because you get a question that you can't answer very well does not mean that you've brought down your IELTS score. So don't be afraid when this happens. It happens to everybody, and when it happens to you, you just wait for the next question and continue as normal. If you get upset by this or if you get anxious by this, you could just end up ruining the rest of your test. So it will happen, expect it, and when it happens, don't worry about it. Also, the thing about part 3 is that you really need to stay focused, and why a lot of students lose focus is because they're exhausted, they're anxious, they've been in the waiting room for a long time, they've been waiting for the test for months, and when they're in there, it's just exhausting. And when they get to part 3, they feel tired, and a lot of them, they just want to get out of the room. They don't want to answer any more questions, they don't want to be there anymore, but you have to stay focused. You have to stay present, you have to listen to the questions, follow the strategy I showed you, fully develop all your answers, and make sure that your performance gives you the highest possible score that you can. If you're tired, just push through. You can take a break after the test. Now, it's really good if you know what to expect from the IELTS examiner in your IELTS speaking test. And the reason is that some students are put off and they think that the strange behaviour of the examiner reflects their poor performance. But that's not the case. The examiner must follow very strict rules about what they can and can't do, what they can and can't say, and if you understand what's going to happen in the IELTS speaking test, that will mean that your performance will not suffer because of the behaviour of the IELTS examiner. Now, when you first walk into the IELTS speaking test, the examiner might not say hello to you. It seems rude, it seems unfriendly, but when they start the speaking test, they need to press record and they need to say hello to you on the recording. So it's a bit weird for them to say hello and then say hello again later because you don't know how to react. So really, a lot of IELTS examiners will wait until the speaking test has started before they actually say hello to you. Now, you can also expect the IELTS examiner to interrupt you and cut you off while you're speaking. And this doesn't mean that you're doing anything wrong. It's because the examiner needs to get through a certain number of questions, they need to change the topics, they need to make sure that they spend 5 minutes on part 1, 3 on part 2, 5 on part 3, and they need to get everything organised appropriately. And to do this, they will need to interrupt you and stop you from speaking from time to time. Don't worry about it, it's going to happen. It doesn't mean anything negative about your score. Just wait, listen to the next question, and continue as normal. So from time to time, it might look like the IELTS examiner isn't actually listening to you, but that's not the case at all. What's really happening is they're organising which questions to ask you next. They're looking at the time to make sure that they don't spend too long on each part of the speaking test. They're looking at the band descriptors to decide which score you get for fluency and coherence, vocab, grammar, pronunciation. They have a lot of things going on. So if they look very busy or distracted, it doesn't mean they're not listening to you. It just means they're organizing all the other things that they need to do at the same time. Now, you might also see the IELTS examiner writing down numbers, and this does scare some IELTS candidates because they think that reflects the scores that they're getting. But that's not the case. This is just a reference for the IELTS examiner to help them remember when each part started and when each part finished, so that they can keep the timing of the test on track. So this lesson is all about what to do in the IELTS test, but my first lesson will show you how the test is scored and how to improve each of your scores. So I would highly recommend you complete that if you haven't already done so. Also, let me know in the comments which part of the IELTS speaking test do you think is the most difficult.